The morning after my wedding, I was standing at the stove before sunrise frying salt pork when Daniel walked into the kitchen and said 4 words I had never heard a man say out loud in my entire life. I was 19 years old. I had been his wife for less than 12 hours. I did not know what those 4 words meant. I did not know if what he was asking for was normal or wrong or something every Amish husband asked and every Amish wife simply understood. I stood there holding the cast iron handle, the fat spitting in the pan, and I said the only thing I could think to say. I said yes. I did not know what I was saying yes to. I only knew that no had never been a word that belonged to me. Stay with me, because what I am about to tell you about what Amish husbands expect the first time they are alone with their wives, and what no one prepares those wives to handle, is going to land differently depending on where you grew up. And if you grew up somewhere like I did, it may not surprise you at all. That is the part that should make all of us stop and think. My name is Martha. I grew up Old Order Amish in Geauga County, Ohio. I left several years ago, and this channel, Hannah the Amish Girl, is where I finally say the things my community would never allow me to say out loud. If what I am sharing here is something you have never heard before, or something you have heard but never seen named, please subscribe and tap the like button, and leave me a comment. Tell me where you are watching from. I read every single one. Now, before I tell you what Daniel said that morning, I need to explain something that took me years outside the community to fully understand, because if I just tell you the words without the world they came from, you will hear them wrong. You will think they were unusual. And that is the problem. They were not unusual at all. In an Old Order Amish community, a young man and a young woman have almost no time alone together before they marry. Courtship happens at Sunday singings, where young people gather after church services and sit at long tables and sing from the ausbund. Boys and girls notice each other across the room. A boy who is interested will arrange, through a brother or a friend, to visit the girl at her home in the evenings. In some communities, this involves bundling, lying clothed in the same bed and talking through the night. In others, it means sitting in the front room while the family sleeps nearby. Either way, there are rules, spoken and unspoken, and the rules are watched by the community with 1,000 invisible eyes. What this means in practice is that by the time a couple stands before the bishop and makes their vows, they may have spent many evenings in each other's presence, but they have almost never been alone. Truly alone. No parents sleeping down the hall, no brothers in the next room, no community rules governing the exact amount of space between their bodies. The wedding night is, for most Amish couples, the first time they are genuinely, completely alone together. And neither of them has been told what to do with that. Here is what surprises people when I explain this. The silence around marriage preparation does not apply only to women. Boys in my community were not educated either. Not by their fathers, not by the church, not by anyone with authority. What boys learned, they learned sideways, from older boys at barn raisings, in whispers during long harvest days, in the same informal underground that ran beneath the official surface of community life. The difference was this: the things boys learned were about what they could ask for. The things girls learned, when they learned anything at all, were about how to endure. I was 17 when I began attending the Sunday singings. I was 18 when Daniel first arranged to visit me in the evenings. He came through the back door, the way it was done, after my parents had gone upstairs. We sat at the kitchen table with the lamp between us, and we talked. Daniel was 22. He was tall and quiet in the way that Amish men who have already spent 10 years doing serious physical work tend to be quiet. He did not say much, neither did I. We talked about the weather and the harvest, and once briefly about a hymn we had both noticed during service. Our hands never touched. He left before midnight. That was courtship. We were engaged for 4 months. In those 4 months, I saw him at church, at community work gatherings, at the occasional meal when our families were together. We were never alone. When people ask me now what I knew about Daniel before I married him, I say what is true. I knew how he looked across a table. I knew the sound of his voice when he spoke carefully in front of other people. I knew his family's farm and his father's reputation and the general shape of the life I was walking into. What I did not know was anything about who he was when no one was watching. That is the man I married, the the one no one had ever seen. The wedding was a Thursday in late November. Our community only holds weddings on Tuesdays and Thursdays, after the harvest season, when the work allows it. The ceremony lasted close to 4 hours, hard wooden benches, long sermons in Pennsylvania Dutch, singing from the Ausbund, the declaration before the bishop, then the meal for what felt like everyone I had ever known. By evening I was exhausted in a way that went deeper than my body. I was exhausted in my mind, in the part of me that had been performing calm and joy for 12 hours straight, in front of 200 people who were all watching to see what kind of wife I would be. When we were finally alone in the house that had been prepared for us, the first night of our married life, I remember the sound of it. The silence after a day that had been so loud, the particular quality of the dark, and Daniel standing in the room with me for the first time with no one else anywhere near, and both of us with no idea what the protocol was now that the ceremony was finished and the performance was over. I remember thinking, this is the person I will wake up beside every morning for the rest of my life. And I did not know him. I did not know the way he slept, or the way he worried, or whether he was the kind of man who filled silence, or the kind who let it sit. I had married the surface of a person, and now the surface had gone to sleep, and I was in the room with what was underneath it. What happened that night, I will not tell you here. There is a part of this story I cannot tell you here. Not on this platform, not under these rules. The algorithm has limits, and I have learned exactly where they are. So I wrote the rest down instead, slowly, without the softening, without the cuts. Everything the camera is not permitted to show. The book is called The Ordnung They Never Wrote Down. 208 pages of what plain life looks like from the inside of it. The link is in the first comment of this video. That is where the part I could not say out loud lives. What I can tell you is what the morning after looked like. I was at the stove before sunrise. I do not know why I woke before him. I think some part of me needed to be doing something familiar, something with my hands, in a kitchen that did not yet feel like mine, in a life that had changed completely overnight and looked exactly the same on the surface. I was frying salt pork. I was listening to the fat in the pan and trying to locate myself inside my own body. And Daniel came into the kitchen, still in his work shirt, his hair not yet combed, and he looked at me across the room and said those 4 words. What he asked for was not physical. That is the part I have thought about so many times since, in therapy, in the long, careful conversations I have had with women who left communities like mine. What Daniel asked for in those first words of our first real morning together was not what I expected. He asked me to tell him something true, something I had never told anyone. He said those exact words, something you have never told anyone. He sat down at the table, elbows on the wood, looking at me like he was genuinely waiting, like this was important to him, like he had been thinking about asking this question for a long time. I stood at that stove for what felt like a very long moment. And then I turned down the flame, and I sat down across from him, and I tried to find something true. It took me almost 10 minutes, not because I had nothing, because I had been taught every day of my life that the truest things were the most dangerous, that keeping yourself private was not dishonesty, it was modesty, that a woman who spoke about what was inside her was making herself vulnerable in a way that was unseemly. You endured privately. You prayed privately. You kept the internal world small and quiet and away from the eyes of others, even your husband. Especially your husband, because what a husband knew about you, he had power over. Finally, I said something. I told him I was afraid of the dark when I was a child, that I used to lie awake in the room I shared with my sisters, and stare at the ceiling and pray for morning, that I still sometimes, even at 19, felt that same weight when the lamps went out. I do not know why I chose that particular truth. Maybe because it felt small enough to be safe. Maybe because it was the first true thing I could reach. He nodded slowly. He did not laugh. He said, I am afraid of failing my father's expectations. He said it simply, the way you say something you have carried quietly for a long time and finally set down somewhere. We looked at each other across that kitchen table in the early morning dark. The salt pork was going cold in the pan. And something shifted. My friend Rachel was married at 20 to a man named Aaron. Her experience of that first morning was different from mine. Aaron did not ask her for truth. Aaron told her, on the morning after their wedding, how the household was to be run, what time breakfast was expected, how the accounts would be kept, what his mother's way of doing things was, and how closely he expected those standards to be maintained, not unkindly. Aaron was not a cruel man in the way that people mean when they say cruel. He simply had a clear picture of what a wife was for, and he communicated it on the first morning, before the first full day had even begun, because that was how he understood the arrangement they had entered. Rachel told me this years later, after we were both settled into our marriages, and the daily texture of them had become familiar enough to describe. She said she had stood in her new kitchen listening to Aaron lay out the expectations, and she had felt something in her chest close very quietly, like a door pushed gently shut. She had not been angry. She had not been hurt in any dramatic way. She had simply understood in that moment what the shape of her life was going to be. And she had decided in the same moment to be good at it, because being good at it was the only choice that belonged to her. I think about Rachel's closed door often. I think about the way a thing can happen quietly enough that it does not feel like a thing happening at all. Aaron was not asking Rachel to be less than she was. He simply had no idea that she was more than he was asking for. And she never told him. Because she had been taught, the same as I had, the same as every woman I grew up with, that keeping the internal world small was not a loss. It was faithfulness. There was a third woman I knew, my cousin by marriage, a quiet woman named Miriam who had grown up in a stricter community than mine, further into the country, where the Ordnung reached into places most communities left alone. Miriam married at 18. Her husband was a deacon's son, respected, reliable, the kind of young man every family in the district considered a good match. On their first morning, Miriam told me years later, he had handed her a piece of paper. Handwritten, a list, not of expectations for the household, like Aaron's, a list of the things she was not permitted to do anymore, now that she was a wife. Small things. Visiting her friend in the neighboring district without asking first. Keeping her own small earnings from selling quilts. Spending more than a certain amount of time at her parents' home in a single week. He handed her the paper the way you hand someone a document they are expected to sign. She stood there holding it. She did not speak. She folded it once and set it on the table and turned back to the stove. She never referred to it again. Neither did he. But she told me, 20 years later, that she had never once forgotten a single item on that list. Because forgetting was not permitted either, even though it was never written down. Here is what I know now that I did not know then. What a husband asks for in those first hours of marriage, in that first true moment of privacy, tells you everything about the marriage you are entering. It tells you whether he sees you as a person he does not yet fully know, or as a role he has been waiting to fill. It tells you whether he is curious about you or certain about you. And it tells you, most importantly, whether the silence you have both been handed by your upbringing will be the air you breathe together, or whether one of you, at least, is willing to try to say something true. Daniel and I sat at that kitchen table for an hour that first morning. We let the salt pork go completely cold. We talked in a way we had never talked across the lamp-lit table during courtship, when the performance of propriety was always present between us. He told me things. I told him things, nothing enormous, nothing that would have meant anything to anyone listening from outside. But for two people who had been taught that the private self was not for sharing, even with a spouse, it was an enormous thing. It was the first morning of a marriage that turned out to have more honesty in it than most I had witnessed growing up. That did not make everything else easy. There were years of learning to live with someone I had not known when I agreed to live with him. There were silences that were not the comfortable kind. There were expectations I had carried from my mother's kitchen and my grandmother's example that did not fit the actual shape of my own life. And there were things Daniel had been taught to want from a wife that I could not always be. We navigated it. Sometimes badly. But we navigated it together, which is more than I can say for what I watched happen in marriages around me, where the navigation happened entirely inside the woman's head, alone, with the door quietly closed. Here is the thing about what Amish husbands demand in those first private hours. There is no single answer, because Amish husbands are men, and men are not a single thing, no matter what any community's ordnung tries to make them. Some of them walk into that first morning with expectations drawn from everything they were taught about what a wife is for. Some of them walk in with their own fear and their own unpreparedness, and their own hunger for something real. The tradition gives them permission to expect. It does not teach them to ask. And the women. The women walk in, having been prepared for endurance, not encounter. Having been shaped toward compliance, not communication. Having been handed a set of tools for surviving marriage that have nothing to do with actually living inside one. The jar of olive oil passed over a fence. The sentence at the quilting bee that sounds like it is about cooking. The mother-in-law who leaves something on the nightstand and never mentions it again. These are not preparation. They are emergency supplies for a war nobody admitted was happening. My younger sister Emma came to me the week before her wedding, 20 years old, hands folded in her lap the way our mother had taught us to sit when we needed to appear composed. She asked me the same question every bride I ever knew was carrying but rarely said out loud. She asked, "What is he going to want from me?" I looked at her for a long time. I thought about everything I could say, everything I had learned slowly and with difficulty that she deserved to know before she needed it. I thought about Rachel's closed door. I thought about Miriam's folded piece of paper. I thought about that first kitchen, the cold salt pork, Daniel's elbows on the table, the lamp not yet lit, both of us trying in our own unpracticed way to find something true to say. I said, "He is going to want you to already know what to do, to already be what he imagines." But that is not what he actually needs. What he actually needs is the same thing you need, which is someone willing to be in the room with him honestly. You do not have to know everything before you walk in. You just have to be willing to stay and find out. And if he is not willing to do the same for you, that is information, the most important information he could possibly give you. Emma nodded. I did not know if she understood. She was 20 and she had been built for compliance the same way I had, and most of what I said would only make sense later, on the other side of the experience itself. But I said it. Because someone should have said it to me. My first morning sits in my memory quietly, the way important things do when you finally understand what they were. Not because it was perfect, not because Daniel was perfect or I was or what came after was simple, because it was the first honest thing we tried to do together. And the world I grew up in never told me I was allowed to try. If you grew up somewhere that taught you your silence was faithfulness, and your needs were vanity, and your private self was something to be kept small and out of sight, I see you. If you walked into a marriage or a relationship or any situation that called itself a promise without the information you needed, I see you. You were not underprepared because you were weak. You were underprepared because the system that raised you needed you that way. And there is a difference. That difference is the whole story. If you want to read the version of this story that YouTube will not allow, the full pages are in the ordnung they never wrote down. First comment of this video. And that is everything. Choose your freedoms wisely. They might just save your life.